So initially, I was gonna record a video for YouTube and like edit it and post it, but I decided that perhaps I will do a live video because it allows people to comment. And I figure right now, with the press my page is getting, the comments might be telling in the nature of how some people approach this discussion. But I wanted to talk a little bit more like on video because in writing stuff is always lost in translation due to the lack of tone involved. And generally, like I've noticed a huge pattern on my page is that people will read like the first two or three sentences of what I post and then create an opinion of what they believe I'm saying that is almost always inaccurate. So video is great for trying to dissuade people from doing that. However, it still has its limitations because people who have already decided that they're committed to misunderstanding me aren't going to listen to this. But I always hold out the hope that the right people will listen and that it's worth doing this. So I wanted to do a video to kind of expand on some of my thoughts and just talk about some of the stuff I'm noticing online with these interactions. And like I want to start by saying right at the beginning of this that I never maintain the perspective that everyone within a certain facet of the horse industry is guilty of the same principles, because saying that everyone does something is an impossible claim to prove, because all you need to do is find one person that doesn't and then your point is thrown out the window. So I'll never say that. What I will say is the horse industry as a collective whole across all disciplines has a lack of accountability when it comes to how we treat horses, and there is a lack of desire to reflect on our practices and how they impact horses. And there's also motive for people to not be super considerate of how their actions impact their horses. Um, and I think that we need to be honest about that and talk about it more, because otherwise, inevitably, we can't fix the industry. We can't make changes to better the lives of horses. Um, and we can't reflect and better practices as we know more and can do better. So it's important to have these discussions. One thing that I think is an overarching theme for the entirety of the horse industry is that there's way too many people who believe that they should be able to handle horses however they want, that they can do whatever they want and not be held accountable for that. And I think that's a massive problem, because we need to be aware of the fact that when we're choosing to be in a sport where we're working with a living, breathing animal, that our actions do matter. Even if you own the horse, your actions are not just impacting you, they're impacting the horse. And it shouldn't be a situation where there's this narrative where no one should be allowed to care about animals that they do not own, because that's a crazy stance to hold. It is so devoid of empathy, and it goes outside of the horse world again, where it's like, you should care about animals that aren't yours. You should care about people that aren't in your close inner circle. You should care about children who are not your children. That is the nature of empathy. All of these people matter, whether or not they're close to you or not. And so when we engage in harmful behavior that is negatively impacting those around us, especially voiceless creatures that cannot advocate for themselves, doing so in the public light, in the public eye, opens you up to criticism, and rightfully so, because people don't owe you turning a blind eye. You're not entitled to people supporting your mistreatment of an animal to such an extent that they look the other way for you. That's not, they don't owe anything to you. And from my perspective, I owe an awful lot more to the horses, because they don't get to consent to anything that they do, because they cannot verbally consent. So if we're going to use them in competition, there needs to be hard lines that are drawn where we are recognizing how our actions impact them. And if we're going to have equine competition be something that is legally continued, we need to be considerate of how it is done. And it really should not be a controversial perspective to say, hey, repeated whipping of horses and condoning it and saying things like it doesn't impact anyone, that is problematic. That shouldn't be a controversial statement. And I've gotten a lot of people that will come at me and go, not all barrel racers do this, but then they're still angry about me talking about it. And it's like, if not all barrel racers do this, prove it through action, showing that you don't agree with that behavior instead of trying to silence the discussion of it. Also, we should be able to operate in life with enough nuance to look at the fact that you can like someone as a person and you could think that they are a generally good person and a generally good horse person while still acknowledging when they mess up, because that post that I criticized is a freaking mess up. And she's had almost a week to correct it and correct what she actually meant if she wasn't doing it to condone the mistreatment of horses or like repeated whipping of horses, and wording it in such a way where there's a nonchalance towards how repeatedly these horses are being hit and saying that it doesn't impact anyone and no one should care. Because whether she does that herself or not, that post is giving license to people who do that to feel good about it and to be like, yeah, that's totally right. My idol said that no one should care about how I treat my horse and that it doesn't impact anyone and that it's only my business. It is pouring fuel on a fire that is harmful to horses. And if that wasn't the intention in posting it, there has been time to correct it and it hasn't happened. There's been an effort to double down, and there's been a lot of people getting highly defensive and honestly gloating about how they repeatedly spur and whip their horses in some cases, where they're posting photos of this happening and basically calling anyone who sees an issue with it like a little coward or like overly sensitive. And it's just, there's a lot of efforts being made to try to make people feel silly and overly sensitive for having an issue with that. But in a lot of other horse sports, and again, I still criticize these sports because they are not well regulated enough for welfare. But in show jumping, for example, which I always say is the barrel racing of the English world, because there's a severe lack of regulations when it comes to equipment. But with whipping, you aren't allowed to repeatedly whip your horse multiple times in a row. You can strike them 3 times consecutively, and if you do it more than that, you get buzzed out of the arena. That doesn't always happen because there's corruption, but it is in the rule book. And I don't really think it should be controversial to say that we shouldn't be repeatedly striking animals if we're going to use them in competition. With that said, people who handle their horses in that way and then want to say in the next breath that the horse likes their job and that they love their job and they love to win, then it begs the question, why do you need to beat them repeatedly in order to get that win if they love it so much? Why do you need to cause discomfort and pain by repeatedly hitting them if they love the job so much? Can someone explain that to me? Because I don't see the logic there. And I say this as someone who has done things that I now condemn. And I'm very open about that. And the part that I found so interesting about this discussion is the amount of people who will go through my account just to dig up photos where they're like, oh, here, you're holding a whip here, you hypocrite, or you're wearing spurs here, you hypocrite. You say that whips are bad, but like, what about here? And even though the photos they're pulling are from posts where I'm talking about how I don't use that equipment and talking about why my perspectives have changed, they still take them because they didn't actually read the post. And on top of that, the photos that people will find of me where I'm holding a whip, none of them are ever going to depict me overhand hitting the horse in the way that the photo that Fallon Taylor posted shows her using it. And I say that with confidence because I haven't used one like that. And if I had in the past, I would own up to it, especially if I'd got it on photos, I would own up to it. And I would tell people, look, this is what I did. I don't agree with it. I don't agree with how I used the whip when I did use it, but I never was so comfortable using it in that repeated aggressive manner. And that's not to say that I'm morally better than people, because there's other things that I did that were just as bad as what is being condoned in that post. But it's really interesting when past mistakes are brought up and they're trying to be used as a gotcha, because really all it speaks for is the fact that I've changed as a person over the last decade, which we all should be doing. And we all should be able to acknowledge where we've made mistakes and where we have thought things that weren't correct or where we've accidentally harmed horses. Because if we're being honest, every single person on this planet has accidentally harmed their horse before, and there's varying degrees of harm. It's not necessarily always going to be like willful neglect or blatant abuse, but we make mistakes. People aren't perfect. And this isn't an issue where it's about being perfect. And that's another argument that gets brought up a lot, where they're like, oh, well, you think you're so perfect. No, I don't. I know I'm not. But the key difference between me and people who are doubling down to defend the behavior that I was criticizing is that they are still defending it. If you don't want to be judged through the lens of thinking that repeated whipping and spurring of horses is okay, it is as easy as saying, I don't think that's okay. I like this rider and I think that she's generally considerate, but she missed with this post. Or I don't think that the whipping in barrel racing is okay. I don't do that. Not all barrel racers do. And I would like to be like applauded for that, or like I would like these types of barrel racers to be showcased more. It's as easy as that. But if you don't separate yourself from your past mistakes by taking accountability and making it clear that you no longer agree with them, then people have every right to judge you for your current stance, because it is not something that you're reflecting on and going, wait, oops, I was wrong. And that is the key difference. There is always time, like even now, there's always time to say, hey, I was wrong, whoops. And she could still do that. I will hold out hope and that she does, because I do think that the post is very damaging, and seeing how many people are using it to justify their repeated hitting of their own horses is very concerning. And it would be really nice to see a correction there if that's actually not what she was trying to put across. But it is cut and dry, written in plain sight on a public post. And I also think that this pressure for people like myself to be silenced, where all these people are coming at me and hurling insults and attacking me and trying to review bomb my business to try to get me to shut up, that entire attitude is part of the overall problem, because the lengths people are willing to go to silence any discussion about welfare issues are so much more aggressive than the tactics being used by most people discussing the welfare. I shared a post, I shared my opinion on the post, and said why it was in bad taste. I didn't review her business. I didn't say that she was a terrible person. I said that the post was in bad taste and I disagree with it. So I disagree with the action. I disagree with the writing. I disagree with this event, which is a single component in someone's life. On the flip side, I'm getting met with people trying to damage my career and telling me that they're going to try to sue me until I have no money and go bankrupt, which they can't do because I haven't broken any laws. So, jokes on people who try to use that for pressure. But what I'm trying to get at is that there's external pressures that people try to apply to shut people up from discussing welfare issues. If barrel racers are not riding abusively and they don't see a problem with it, what threat does someone like me pose? What can I do if you guys don't feel you're doing anything wrong, you know? My words are just words if there is nothing to substantiate them. The fact that people react this way, one, it tells me that they are well aware of how big the issue is and how prevalent it is, and they are fucking terrified of it being brought to light, to the surface, where it might get dealt with by outside entities that force their hand at change. And if they're afraid of that, there's a reason for it. And it means that deep down, regardless of how much they fight tooth and nail to justify it, that there is an unsettled feeling where they feel like something might be wrong. And if that's the case, I'm not your problem. It's your internal guilt. And I'm just bringing that to the surface by talking about these things. And I don't say that as a judgment. I say that as someone who has gone through the very same process, because I used to react angrily and defensively when people would call to question things that I blindly supported, and I didn't want to have to reflect on them. So I got mad at the people who forced that reflection by saying something that I couldn't look away from. And I made my reaction their problem, even though it was 100% my problem, and it was the wrong thing to do. I was reacting from a place of fear, anxiety, and inner guilt, and I was lashing out at the people who brought that to the surface. And I see that happening time and time again to myself and many other welfare advocates that are out here on Facebook and other social platforms that are having these hard conversations. But these conversations are necessary, because without them, it's essentially an echo chamber where anyone can do whatever they want, whenever they want, without any consequences. And that's not healthy for anyone involved, because another aspect of this is that it's not just the horses that are being impacted by this. The abuse towards horses is just a part of the puzzle. There's also massive abuse towards people. There are people who are being systematically targeted by their trainers and pressured into compliance by trainers and coerced into doing things that are dangerous, that they're afraid of, that they don't want to do, or who fear their lives being ruined if they come out and speak out against a prevalent trainer who has assaulted them or done something that is absolutely not okay. And these same types of pressures with review bombing, social pressure, and mob mentality are used to try to silence those people from coming forward about the instances of abuse that they have faced. So it impacts the people too, and these same attitudes are used to uphold abusive behavior towards humans as well. and it's all interconnected. And in order to deal with the issue in the sport, we need to look at all of this. And I've taken this whole interaction as kind of a social experiment because I do find it very, very interesting to see the differences in how people in the barrel racing industry are reacting to my content versus people in the English industry. Because, for example, I've talked about dressage several times more often than barrel racing, and I've gone after some of the top riders in the world for practice, and I've done it on a repeated basis for years. And despite that repetition of that happening, I've only gotten one person who's tried to review bomb me in that industry. And I don't get the same level of anger and upset. I can't even really recall more than a handful of times where the riders that I'm talking about have even replied to me because they don't have the same level of concern. So it does make me wonder how much insidious stuff is going under the surface at barrel races that is not being documented to the same extent that Olympic sports get documented, and if that's why they're so afraid, because it's a very odd, over the top reaction. And whenever I get reactions like this, I always go back and I read my posts several times to be like, okay, like what, like if they're saying that I say all barrel racers do that, did I actually say something that could be viewed that way? And no, the post that I wrote about Fallen Taylor was all about her and the influence that she has and what she's actually saying in that post and what it means for people and how that impacts horses and how you can't just repeatedly whip a horse and have it not impact anyone. That is what the post is about. I don't call her a bad person. I say the post is in poor taste and that it sounds a bit whiny, which that's probably the one phrase in that post where people could say it's mean. But then if you look at the responses that I'm getting to that post, I'm being called whiny, I'm being called attention seeking, I'm being called a nobody, I'm being called a fraud, I'm being called a fake trainer, I'm being called a loser, I'm being called someone said I was a 12-year-old and they're infantilizing me, which is again another tactic that's often used on young women to shut them the fuck up. But here's the thing, I'm not one of those women. That's not who I am. I know how it feels to be shut down and silenced, and the pit that you get in your stomach when you've been forced into a position where you're not responding to things how you want to and where you have no voice. I grew up feeling that way, and I will not let people do that to me on this platform because now I do have a community and I have supporters who can support me in what I do and create some type of safety net. There's tons of other creators that do not have that, and if I were to back down to bullshit like this, it opens the door for those creators to be pressured in a similar way and not have the same safety net. So no, I will not do that. I'm doing this for myself, my younger self who didn't have these protections and who was too scared to speak out, and I'm doing it for all of the other creators who've tried to comment on similar things and have gotten their small businesses review bombed and people to try to pressure them into silence when they are not doing anything wrong. The only wrong they're committing is expressing concern about the welfare of horses, and people are so threatened by that that they try to assassinate the character of someone else. And that is the key difference. I'm not calling out Fallen Taylor to be mean or to bully her or to say she's a bad person. I'm calling her out because she's a role model with a huge following and she's condoning practices that are harmful to horses. And she has the opportunity to say that that's not okay and to change her mind and to self-reflect and to make a change. And if she does that, you want to know what? My perspective on her will shift accordingly. And I'll be like, that is great, that is bold. It's really hard to admit that you're wrong, especially after this type of back and forth interaction. But on my end, I do not feel like I have done a wrong in this circumstance because I firmly am in the camp that it should not be this controversial to advocate for not repeatedly whipping horses, especially when the vast majority of disciplines do not condone that level of violence towards horses in the competition ring. Yes, it still happens in warm up. Yes, all of them have their own issues, but there are more regulatory steps in place. One second. Queso, come on. There's more regulatory steps in place to prevent people from abusing their horses to that degree in the competition ring, and barrel racing doesn't have that, and clearly it fucking needs to because these people cannot police themselves. And for all of the barrel racers who are not beating their horses in this way and who do not agree with it, it also sucks for them because the people who are getting a lot of the limelight are participating in these practices and being very open and public about their doing so. And it reflects poorly on everyone that is involved in that industry, and it sucks for them because it results in people judging them at face value based off of the other big names in that industry, and that's not fair either. So it's something that needs to be discussed because the mob mentality and the absolute like incessant effort that people put in to try to silence any type of welfare discussion about things that really shouldn't be that controversial, because it's not even like I said all whips are bad, anyone who holds a whip is an abuser, never wear spurs, blah blah blah. I didn't say that. It's all about repeatedly striking the horse with the whip while flailing your legs around and starfishing and nailing them in the sides of spurs. And that is such a severe use of both whips and spurs that we should all be able to agree that that isn't okay. And the fact that, oh my God, queso, the fact that that is such a hard discussion for so many people, it shows how far behind we are when it comes to ethics, because a lot of other animal sports do not justify shit to the same level as what we do with horses. We use the size and the body mass of horses and their lack of predictability as an excuse to mistreat them repeatedly when it wouldn't fly with other people. And if all of this stuff was brought to the light in the public eye, and horses were, even for one night, if we got one night where horses and horse sports were watched to the degree that something like football is, watch how quickly the sport will collapse. Because people see at face value how fucked up some of the stuff that we do is, and they will call it out, and it'll rally the troops to have people want to collapse the sport because they're going to be appalled by what they see. If we go full mask off in the media for people who haven't been desensitized to these things and show them what's going on, it is usually very apparent, to the point where occasionally with stuff like this where I'm having mass outcry acting like I'm the villain for saying, hey, let's not beat horses, I'll send some of these posts to people that know nothing about horses, and I will get their perspective on things and be like, hey, look at this photo and this write-up that this person wrote, what do you think about it? And I don't share what I think about it because I want to know what they think. And I have yet to discover a single non-horse person who has looked at some of these posts that I've later shared on my page and been like, oh yeah, that's fine, that's totally normal. In fact, sometimes I'll choose posts that are like more on the cusp, where it's more, it's not as bad, and people will be like, is that horse happy? And it's to the point where it's like the average horse person wouldn't even see an issue with it. It's not as contentious as what's going on with this issue. So they see issues typically sooner than the average horse person does, and we are going to lose our social license as a sport if we do not get our shit together. People that get mad at people like me, the ironic thing is that I'm actually advocating for their own interests and their own access to the sport to a greater extent than they are, because if they go unchecked and never self-reflect, they are going to end up tanking their own sport. So people who try to clean up the sport and improve horse welfare and improve the societal perception of horse sports are actually on their side, whether they see it or not, because we don't want to see the sport collapse and go through the absolute shit show that is going to be big welfare organizations making the decision for us. And honestly, that's already well on its way. I don't even really know if we're at the point of no return yet. I kind of feel like we might be. And if that's the case, then it's like, at least we tried. But like, even when that happens, here's what's going to happen. If the sport does collapse and like in a big way welfare organizations come forward and they don't believe that we're actually going to make necessary changes, which at this point I don't blame them, because so many people double down and fight tooth and nail to defend using unethical practices that it looks to a lot of people that we are not willing to change. But if the sport collapses, you want to know the first people that these people that are arguing on my page right now are going to blame? People like me. They're never going to look inwards at their own practices and go, wow, if I had altered the way I do things and if we didn't justify all these problematic things, this might not have happened. And you want to know the reason for that? It's because these people feel entitled to doing whatever they want, regardless of who it hurts, and they want to be able to do that unchecked. They feel entitled to just being able to make decisions for themselves selfishly and not ever consider the impacts that it has on other beings. And if you choose to operate in your life in that way, you cannot do so while also being entitled to no one ever commenting on the harm that you're causing. That's not how it works. You have to be considerate of your horse. If your horse is going to be under you, winning you medals and buckles and ribbons, you should give a shit about how your actions feel to the horse. You shouldn't be so nonchalant about repeatedly beating your horse and causing them pain just because it wins. And the number of people who are just like, oh, well, they win a lot, so it's fine. That makes you look worse. that makes you look worse if you think winning means that any means to the end to get that win is okay. That is so insanely corrupt, like morally corrupt, to have that perspective. Why is it that some people's sole measure of ethics is whether or not you win? Like, who fucking cares if you win, if you have to be like, like if I was in a car race and I hit my best friend with a car, no one's gonna be like, oh, well, you still won. Like, she's okay, she's hospitalized with a few broken bones, but you still won. Like, that is insane. So if ethics are thrown out of the window just to get a win, that can't happen. Like, we shouldn't be justifying that. There is a question that's set from horse centered approach that says, do you think things are changing? Also, how do you eliminate negative reinforcement altogether? I'm in the process of including positive reinforcement. I think things are changing in the sense that we're getting more people who are more willing to call out welfare issues and bring them to the surface, and that's really great. But in the process of that happening, there's going to be a lot more infighting and just general rage because people who have gotten to bury their negative practices for a long time are now starting to feel very threatened and very scared, and they're lashing out like trapped animals. And we're going to see more of that because the pressure is increasing, and anyone who is still stubbornly refusing to consider any change is just going to continue doubling and tripling down and continuing to justify their practices and never reflecting on whether or not they're part of the problem, because especially the longer you stay in that phase, the harder it is to finally admit that you're wrong, because it is embarrassing. If you spend years publicly doubling down and saying things, coming out and being like, I was wrong, is embarrassing. Again, as someone who's done that, if anyone wants to scroll far enough back on my YouTube page or on this page, you will find posts where I'm doing stuff that I for sure would not be okay with now. You'll find them, and you'll also see comment responses that are out of character for who I am now because I have changed. And it was embarrassing. It was a hard process, but the more you embrace doing that, and the more you embrace saying, hey, I was wrong, here are the mistakes I've made, and you own it and you bring it to the public, one, it takes the bullets out of the shame gun that people can shoot at you because you've owned up to your mistakes. What is someone going to say to you and make fun of you for a past mistake if you're just like, yeah, I know? It completely unloads their ability to try to mock you for any shifts that you've made. So it's a powerful thing to do, but it's something that needs to happen on a more broad scale, especially with big name riders, because we need to normalize admitting when you're wrong and admitting when you've made a mistake, because that opens the door for all of these smaller riders to be less embarrassed about doing so. So that's part of it. Regarding like phasing out negative reinforcement, I don't fully think it's possible to completely phase it out of everything, because there's going to be instances, even if accidentally you apply a negative reinforcer. I think the goal should just be to use as much rewards based training as possible and just be considerate of like the methodology by which we're teaching horses how to do things. I think the biggest problem in the horse world is just how coercive so much of what we ask them to do is, and how little time we give horses to actually process things and really start to like get to interact with their environment, and like when they're scared, just like giving them a freaking second to just like take in the environment. Everything is rush, rush, rush. I want this done now. I need to win. You need to be faster, and I need it done right now. And there's so much pressure and coercion, and it's like animals cannot be happy in their sport when they are under that level of duress, and it's just so unnecessary. It's so selfish and human centric and egotistical, and it just desperately needs to shift. And we need to start to shift away from results first and how those results were maintained as like an afterthought to, if someone is winning, the most important part of that and they're winning should be how it was achieved. It's not impressive if someone's winning and cleaning up at the upper levels if they had to harm horses in the process, especially when most horse people that you talk to will say they're in the sport for the horse. But talk is cheap. What I would tell people to do is like, if you have an idol or a friend or anyone who's saying that they're in the sport for the love of the horse and that they love horses, what do their actions say about them? Because someone who is truly dedicated to this sport because of their love for horses, even if they're initially defensive, at some point they're going to reflect and go, wait, there's a lot of people telling me that this is harmful. What if it is? What if it is? What if I am accidentally causing this animal that I love harm? And then they're going to look inward and start reflecting on the manner in which they do things, even if it's difficult. They're going to consider whether or not their actions are harmful to their horses. The people that refuse to do that and that gloat and joke about hitting their horses and the bits that they use and just mock everyone who even considers having a more empathetic approach. I don't believe that a lot of those people are motivated by a love for the horse, at least not right now. I think that when they first got into the sport, there probably was, because most of us do get into the sport because of that love. But eventually, that love for the horse turns into a love for the sport, where the horse is then viewed as an inconvenience when they're not directly participating in the person's success in the sport. So when the horse is sore, scared, anxious, confused, frustrated, whatever, that is then viewed as an inconvenience if it disrupts the person's path to their goals, and then they are angry at the horse. And that is the driving force behind most of these issues, is that level of entitlement to chasing your goals at any cost and viewing the horse's lack of submission to your path to your goals as an inconvenience. And it justifies so much unethicality and just like mistreatment, because people are willing to do whatever they need to in order to get ahead. And it shouldn't be that way. A sport that is actually about the love of the horse should have that basically written into the rule book, where it's like, we're not even going to give people the opportunity to abuse these types of equipment to the extent that they are. So, like, a whipping regulation would be a great start, because I know people would flip their fucking lid if you banned whips right now. But like, even if they copied show jumping and they're like, hey, no more than 3 consecutive strikes in a row, that would be a huge difference. And the fact that that would inconvenience so many people just to change the rule to something like that, that should be very reasonable, speaks for a lot of how these people are taking shortcuts and how little they're actually considering their horse in the process of producing them to that level. Because realistically, if you can't get your horse around like a 20-second or less pattern without striking it more than 3 times, that's fucking insane. That's more than 3 times, like that's more than 1 time every 10 seconds. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not, and again, this is not me saying that I even agree with the act of whipping in the first place, because you're using pain to try to get a horse to run faster. And I think that's an inherently flawed thing to do if we want them to like the sport. But the fact that so many people are adverse to the idea of not hitting your horse like multiple times every second, that it really speaks for just how corrupted the sport is, because that shouldn't be such a profoundly, my dog, a profoundly angering argument. Um, and it is. Like, again, like, show jumpers, 3 consecutive strikes, they're going to be riding the, unless they're doing a jump off, they're going to typically be riding the pattern longer than the average barrel racer is doing theirs. And even if they are doing, even if they are, oh my god, my dog, sorry guys, even if they are doing a jump off, typically the jump offs are shorter than a barrel pattern, and there's more rules in place to prevent them from striking. And also, the types of whips that you're allowed to use typically don't hurt as much as like the over under whips that barrel racers are using. So realistically, like, this shouldn't be as contentious of a topic as it is, and it's honestly quite exhausting and just like demoralizing to see the lengths people are willing to go to justify their right to just relentlessly beat their horses. And there's really no other way to put it, because like, I'm not just talking about tapping your horse with the whip once. I'm talking about overhand strikes repeatedly hitting your horse and justifying that at like it's okay, while saying that it doesn't harm anyone and no one should care about that. Like, that is just, it is just such an outrageously insane statement that I just don't understand why people are okay with that. And the fact that it is such a controversial sentiment to so many of these people, that they're actually trying to ruin my business because of it, I think speaks for the underlying motives of a lot of those people. Again, I don't need to know people to say this, because they're using some of the same types of pressure and coercive tactics to try to make me submit as what I'm sure they use on their horses based off of what they're defending. So like I said, it's all interconnected, where if people treat a horse a certain way, they're very likely to treat people in a similar way, or just be like less connected to empathy in general. So there needs to be a line. And like, I think that's a great question to ask people, is like, okay, well, where do you draw the line? Like, when does whipping, in your opinion, become too much if you think that repeated whipping is totally fine? If you think that no one should be able to say anything, like, where do you draw the line? Does the horse have to be riddled in blood and welts before it matters? Do you have to actually physically see the damage that you're doing before you care? Or when is it going to start to matter? Because the other thing too is that the idea that if a horse is really being abused, they'll be all marked up. That is so horrifically harmful. You shouldn't have to beat an animal to the point where there are visible marks before it is considered abuse, because you have to hit them pretty freaking hard to do that. Like, these horses are pretty resilient animals, and they're pretty, like, they can take a lot, and they have a pretty high pain tolerance overall, and they mask pain because they're a flight animal. But it's like, at what point are people going to finally acknowledge it's too much? And like, that's also the concern that I have with so many of these justifications, is that it makes me wonder when they would be like, oh, that's too far, because it's just such a high degree of mistreatment that they are like justifying and advocating for, because it's not even just a whip versus spur issue. Like, I'm usually pretty careful to not just be like, anyone who uses spurs or whips is a terrible person and is beating their horse, because there are ways you can use them in a much more gentle manner. I would like to see the horse world get to the point where they aren't so commonplace, and where people have different avenues of getting the results they want without those. But the issue is like the deliberate misuse of them, and the abuse of using them to the level of intensity that some people are. That's the entire issue. It's not the fact that people have them on their person. And I also find that that is something that people use to try to derail my argument quite often, where they're like, oh, so everyone who uses a whip or a spur is abusive. And it's like, no, I didn't say that. But that is a logical fallacy that's being attempted to discredit my argument and completely misconstrue the point that I'm actually making, so that they don't have to feel bad about themselves. And I think part of the reason too, like with the posts that I make, that I can that I'm good at triggering that feeling in people, is because I know the justifications that they're going to use, because I have used them in the past. And I think that makes it pretty difficult for people who want to remain in a delusion, if I'm intimately familiar with what it felt like to be where they are, and I can see where it's coming from and respond within that lens, because it just makes it more exposed and in their face. And I think that's why I elicit the types of reactions that I do, because it brings it to light. And again, I remember how it felt. But like, the thing is too, I don't regret people calling me out on my shit. I don't wish that that didn't happen, because if they didn't do that, I might not have changed. I changed because of pressure online, and also seeing other people post things in the way that I am now. And initially, I wasn't always receptive to those things, and I would get really defensive. But it ultimately led to this shift. Without those people taking the time out of their day to do those things, I might not have shifted. And that's why this work is so important to me, because I believe that everyone is subject to change, because I know I did. And I also maintain the notion where it's like, I'll judge people based off of who they are showing me to be right now. If they admit that they're wrong and they apologize and they make a shift, I'm going to welcome them. And I'm going to, like, I might be more cautious depending on to what extent they abused horses in the past, how quick the change is, and whether or not it seems sincere. I'll be more cautious, but I'm never going to close the door and be like, screw you, I don't like you. Um, because everyone is subject to change. Even some of the worst offenders for horse abuse, if they actually went through a moral shift and really reflected and changed, I would be stoked. That's best case scenario, is having them actually shift internally instead of just having the pressures of regulations cause them to shift. That'd be amazing. Um, but oh, I have a question from Samantha Fletcher. What do you need from us? How can we support you? Well, thank you for asking. That's really nice. I'd say, like, honestly, just people's comments and like sharing the posts so that other people can see them, because I do think that also, with all the vitriol that's going on in the comment section, it is annoying, but it does offer the opportunity for people who are on the fence or who do not want to get involved but still hold views that might be harmful to horses, to read through them and see the different arguments, and that can change perspectives. Another thing would just be like, with the people trying to review bomb my page, it's not working very well, because a lot of people are making positive reviews in return, which is really nice, and I appreciate that. And I don't want to take reviews down. I'm just going to be completely forthright about that. I don't want to have to remove something that is meant so that actual clients and people can review my business and be honest about it. I don't want to have to remove that because people are trying to pressure me into changing how I handle myself online. So they're going to stay up. So if people keep review bombing, anyone making a nice review to bring it back to where it was is nice, because I used to have 100% average, and the only bad reviews that are on there are from people who don't like my posts, which is a little bit annoying. But I do think that actual clients, if they go through my reviews, it's going to be pretty freaking clear what the motives are. So I'm not overly concerned about that. The other thing is that for anyone who's interested in like behind the scenes work and tutorials, or just like supporting my work, you can subscribe to Patreon for as little as $1 a month and access the tutorials and whatnot, and as well as behind the scenes stuff, or just offer general support, because I do a lot of free content. And I'm reliant on like using how content boosts my page to market other aspects of my business for money, in addition to like training horses and whatnot as well. So that type of stuff really helps, because I do want to make my content as accessible as possible, because the people who need to see it the most aren't necessarily always going to be in the camp where they're willing to pay for it. So anyone who does like what I post, whether or not they're motivated by seeing the behind the scenes or the tutorials, that also does help, because then I can put up more and more free content and dedicate more time to filming that. Which is my plan for like going forward into the spring and summer. In the wintertime, I don't really film a lot with my horses. I'm not doing as much training. We've had pretty disgusting weather, and it's just kind of like a rest period for me. And there's also just been a lot of stuff going on in my life, which I think is also part of this whole discussion too, where a lot of people will try to discredit my opinion on things because I'm not riding enough in their opinion, or I'm not like showing enough in their perspective. And that's also part of this whole toxic mindset, where you shouldn't need to be actively riding to be like, hey, like hitting horses repeatedly with a whip is wrong. And also, just the entire notion that in order to be taken seriously, you need to be constantly productive is so toxic. There was times where my horse was on hoof rehab and he couldn't be ridden comfortably, and I still had people trying to shit on me for what I was doing, because they're like, "Oh, well, you're not even riding your horse right now." When in reality, if we're valuing good horsemanship, someone knowing when to take a break and give their horse time off should be viewed as a good thing. And also for yourself too, if you're struggling or you're depressed or you have too much stuff going on and you just know you're not in a good place to work with horses, knowing when to take a step back and rest is actually a very good thing. And the fact that it's something that's approached with shame is really problematic, and that needs to shift. Regarding asking if I do subscribers on Facebook online academies, most of my tutorials I post to my Patreon. Like, I do have the subscription option on Facebook, but I need to get better about posting it, and I will eventually, because I'm planning on hopefully eventually hiring someone who can queue all of the posts that I film and make it easier. Right now, it's very overwhelming to post on all of the platforms that I do. Especially for subscriber stuff, and like get all that up. So it's honestly, it's not a regular thing, but if people want to subscribe to that, that also does help, and I do really appreciate it. But online academies and online courses is definitely something that I'm planning to move towards too, and that'll be something that I'm going to start filming once the weather is better, because that's what I think will make training the most accessible. Because like obviously clinics and individual sessions are very expensive depending on where you are and like where I have to travel to and whatnot. So I do want to try to make it like online, like really easy, digestible, bite-sized videos that go over these concepts. Because I think a lot of the training, it goes beyond like actually knowing how to teach just the thing that you're teaching. I think that for a lot of people to really shift their mindset, they need to understand why you want to do it that way, or like why the horse feels a certain way about something, or why something might be frightening or fear inducing to the horse, and start to understand the whys behind things more, because it makes it a lot easier to make informed decisions for yourself and for your horse. And like maybe that's just me being neurodivergent, but the why, and like understanding why things in the world function the way that they do, and why people even respond to things the way they do, and becoming more in tune with my own emotions and my own perspectives on things, that has been really huge in helping shape my perspective on things and helping change my mind on things and helping me understand them better, is just having more information. um, so I think that's all really important, and that's kind of what I want to move towards. But I think that this whole discussion is really important, because I think that we do need to make note of how people respond to welfare discussion and how contentious the discussion is. And what I would also say that I've noticed, and people can agree or disagree with this, it doesn't really matter, the level of perfection and like the standard that people who are advocating for horse welfare are held to, where they have to say everything in the perfect way and they have to never aggravate anyone. There's always so much criticism and pressure placed on people who try to advocate for horse welfare about how they should go about it in the perfect way so that people will listen, and also they're held accountable for how other people react to their content. But then people who are actively doing things or training in a harmful manner towards horses, my dog is annoying my cat. People that are actively training their horses in a harmful way, or like they're if they're actually training in a harmful way and hurting their horses, they're not held to the same standard where it's like, hey, don't do that, that impacts someone negatively. So it's just really interesting because there's this narrative where if you're going to speak out against harmful behavior, that you have to do so in a perfect way and never elicit a negative response in anyone, and that you have to basically walk on eggshells and be flawless in your advocacy and never make a mistake. But on the flip side, people who are making mistakes that are actively harming the welfare of horses, or they're encouraging other people to harm the welfare of horses, they're not held to the same standard, where their mistakes are viewed as mistakes at face value and where they're being held accountable in the same way about their conduct and what they're advocating for. Okay, so can you not knock over my ring light, please? Um, so there's just like a very different approach to it, and it basically prioritizes people that want to engage in harmful training methods and makes them basically get a free pass to do that. Meanwhile, anyone who notices it and calls it out is held to oh my god, my freaking cat, is held to a far greater standard of perfection. And that's also part of the problem. We shouldn't have to maintain perfect advocacy. Part of advocacy is learning how to be an advocate as you go, and learning how to respond to different people and changing the way that you do things as you go. And it takes practice, and you can't really have that practice without being an advocate in the first place. So I think that that's something to take note of. Is I notice that when I respond to people who are deliberately mistreating me and horses, and who are doing things like trying to damage my career and my access to things, oftentimes people start to police my tone more than they do the people trying to pressure me into behaving a certain way by trying to damage my livelihood. And if you have more of an issue with someone's response to being mistreated than you do to the mistreatment itself, that's a problem. And this applies to people and horses, because there's been a lot of cases where horses will explode because someone is too rough with them, and then people will be like, oh, well, that's a dangerous horse, so that's why they need someone to be rough with them. But it's like, no, the roughness and the lack of patience is what created that response. And on the flip side, me posting people who are trying to tank my career through the reviews, people viewing that as an injustice and saying that I should just ignore it, is essentially saying that I should just eat the cost that is people trying to damage my career through false reviews, and just allow them to do so and to pressure me in that way. And that's something I very much don't agree with, because it's a tactic that can ruin a lot of people who don't have the same influence that I have built for myself on this platform. So I do think that accountability is important, and that we need to start to normalize the idea that people holding other people accountable for the harm that they cause, that shouldn't be viewed as more of a problem and like more disruptive than actively participating in the harm. It shouldn't be viewed as more disruptive to be like, hey, let's not beat horses, as it is to actually physically be beating the horses. And yet, oftentimes, even people who do not advocate for those types of practices, a lot of them are more outraged by the discomfort of having it called out and brought to light than they are about the abusive acts themselves. And that needs to change, because it is an uncomfortable conversation. That's not to say that this is ever going to be something that's comfortable. It's always going to be uncomfortable, and there's people who aren't ready to hear it, and you're always going to have people who react defensively and who don't want to hear what you have to say if they just aren't ready for it. And the fact that that is a thing doesn't mean that it shouldn't be said, because for those who are ready to hear it, it's a very important discussion. And also, it's also not about perfection, be it in advocacy or how you handle your horses. You don't have to be a perfect horse person, but self-reflection is important. So you can make mistakes, but the thing is how do you respond to those mistakes? Do you respond by doubling down and defending all of them and never having anything ever be your fault? or do you respond by looking at them and going, okay, I might have made a misjudgment here? And it doesn't even need to be with immediacy. It can be later down the line, but like how often are you actually doing that? And that's what sets the tone and changes like the response that you do get from people, because people will make mistakes, but it doesn't come across as a mistake if you're currently defending it. That's basically what I'm trying to say. Yeah, so yes, I would, and yeah, with Becca, who just said, I think that everyone in the comments and in the reviews should act in a more mature way about things such as refraining from name calling, etc. I agree. And I think that like it's hard on either side, where if people are getting like upset, especially when someone comes at you hurling insults at you first, it's hard not to be reactionary in the same way. But I agree with that, that if you do that, you're actually giving more fuel to those people to justify their stance and to justify treating other people in that way. So that's definitely a thing as well. And I would say, like, with the reviews, for anyone looking at them, the most helpful thing with the reviews is just to like counteract the negative reviews by making a nice one, or report their review, report their comment. Or if you are going to say anything to them, just comment on the review. Don't go to their profiles or send messages or anything like that. It's not necessary. And I just want people to be held accountable for doing stuff like that, in the sense that like people are seeing what they're doing, and if their account gets reported and they get a strike, that's on them. But yeah, so I don't know. Accountability is a big thing, and I think that's also one of the things that's the most misunderstood on my page from people that come here from other areas, where they have this idea that I'm expecting them to be perfect and that they can never make a mistake, when in reality, what I'm actually reacting to is their response to the mistakes. When someone says, hey, that might be harmful to your horses, how do you respond? And like on the flip side, I've had people come on this page and tell me that like clicker training horses is harmful, and that's what they believe. And I'll give them my side of things, but I don't get defensive to the degree of what we're seeing right now, because I don't believe that it is harmful. And I think that from what I've learned and like the current research, that it's supported by that, and I'm comfortable with what I'm doing. And when I do learn more and I think of better ways to do things, then I'm going to pivot and change things accordingly. And I'm really comfortable with where I am currently, and just being like reflective on that. Like I'm comfortable with the way I handle my horses. I'm comfortable with the shifts that I've seen in them, and there's always speed bumps along the road. So it's, again, it's not to say that my horses are always perfect and that everything is like all happy go lucky and fun all the time, but I'm more comfortable with where I am in my life right now than I was when I was actively being defensive and responding to things like how these people online are. And I do want to use my platform for the greater good of like improving horse welfare, but I also think it's important to draw attention to how people treat, primarily like the reactions that I get. I'm very confident that if I was a man, I wouldn't be treated the same way. So it's specifically young women and how they're spoken to online, and like how often people who don't like what I have to say try to infantilize me and talk down to me and patronize me. I want to bring all of that to light too, because it's all part of the same collective issue that I'm discussing. And people can view that as like dramatic or whatever if they want to. That's fine. But the reason why I want to talk about these things is because they're all connected, and I do have a platform. Oh my, Phoebe, come here. The cat and the dog are just like having a time. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of why I do things the way I do, and I like doing these lives because I find that when I have tone behind things and I can actually explain things, that it comes across differently. However, like, not to toot my own horn, I think that writing is one of my strongest skills. And I think that generally speaking, I get my point across very well in writing if people read the entire thing. So I'm just trying to throw stuff to distract the cat from chasing around the dog. But I think I generally get my point across pretty effectively in writing if people actually read it and they take it in before responding emotionally. I think that I'm pretty effective at doing that. However, it lacks the tone that I have, and I do have a tendency to talk about things like, or write about things in like a matter of fact way, where I just say like, this is how things are, especially when I'm talking about like scientifically proven facts or just like research based stuff. I'll just be like, this is that, because that's how you would write if you're writing like a school paper, like an article that is with the purpose of just informing people. You don't write through the lens of being concerned about emotion. And then also for like trying to not have things get too lengthy and wordy, that's also another part of it. So I think in writing that, that's where it gets lost. And it is unfortunate that like it, I don't think the people who are ever actually really triggered by my writing listen to like my podcast or my videos or anything like that. But I think if they did, they'd get a different idea of like who I am as a person, because it's just so far off base to perpetuate this notion that I am this person who thinks I'm perfect and flawless and who never has done anything wrong in my life, because it's quite the opposite. The wrongs that I have committed to horses are literally why I do what I do. They're why I've opened this platform and why I talk about these things, because I do think that that shift and that change is so important. And I'm trying to help other people do the same thing by sharing my story and sharing my thoughts. And as riled up as some of my posts get some people, I'm firmly in the camp that online, if you don't like what someone has to say, you can block them. So, like, if these people really hated seeing my face on their pages, they could block me and ignore me, and I would cease to exist in their world. But that seldom actually happens, because part of why, at least speaking from my past experience, part of why people repeatedly comment and try to argue their case is not because they're trying to prove it to me, they're trying to prove how they feel to themselves. And they're trying to solicit the support of other people who feel the same way as them. And that's why they don't want to block me and why they perpetually come onto my page, because there is that internal pull, that curiosity towards the information, where they feel like in order to get comfortable with the stance that they want to hold, they need to tear me down and degrade me and my opinion in order to feel safe. And I used to do a similar type of thing. Like, I never took it to the degree of like review bombing people and doing stuff like that, but I would get snarky and I would have comments and opinions with people who said things that challenged my current worldview, and that's what I did. So I see where it's coming from, but that's also why I don't really let that stop me, because they have full jurisdiction and power to just like cut me out of their social media life. On the flip side, the horses cannot do that. If horses could just block their owners and never have to deal with them again when they did something wrong, we would be in a very different place ethically, but they can't. So they're reliant on people advocating for them. And that's why that's so important for me. And honestly, like the collective entirety of like all of my social channels, my biggest priority is advocating for the people and animals who have the most. Oh my god, I'm gonna go stop my dog, or is my kitten being annoying? But the biggest, like my biggest priority is advocating for the voiceless, the people that don't have as much societal and social support, the horses who cannot speak for themselves. That is my priority. I don't prioritize advocating for people who are already represented more in society and who already have protections via privilege. And that's why I don't really buy into the narrative where people feel like they should be able to harm like blindly and not be considerate of how their actions impact anyone. So that's what it's all about. And I hope that like the people who listen to this, I hope this clarifies what I'm actually trying to get at, because I have absolutely nothing against Fallen Taylor as a person other than what she's advocating for and like the actions that she's choosing to do towards her horses. If that changes, I have no beef with her. I don't think she's a terrible person. There's good in everybody. I don't think that what she's doing in this context is good. And I think that she's influencing a lot of people to do the same, which increases the level of harm that her actions pose. And that's that. And that doesn't mean that I think she's an irredeemable person. She still has time to redeem herself. I'm disappointed with the post that she made today, because that would have been a great time to admit to wrongdoing in some capacity and just be more conscious. Because also, before I even replied to her post, that for 5 days there's other people saying similar things to what I said and taking issue with it. So she's had the chance to reflect on whether or not those comments have any merit, and she hasn't yet. And I think that based off of that, it is fair to make judgments based off of that, because it's looking at what someone is showing you their character is repeatedly. And again, she still can shift and pivot and say what she actually meant, and say if she thinks that post is in poor taste based off of her post from today. I don't think she thinks that right now, so then my perspective on it remains the same. And I would apply this exact same thinking to like any type of horse person, where it's like ultimately you are who you show yourself to be repeatedly. If you are repeatedly being told how you're being harmful to people or animals, especially in cases like this where it's like unsolicited or like repeated beatings or just like whatever, if you're repeatedly being told that and you continue to do what you're doing, then that's the choice that you're choosing to be. People tell me that I'm bullying people when I do stuff like this, and they're entitled to feeling that way. I don't think that it falls under bullying, because talking about people regarding their actions is different than talking like then doing character defamation and just coming at who someone as a whole, saying, hey, you did this, I don't like that, that's not bullying. So I do think that people weaponize the term bullying to try to shut down discussions pertaining to accountability. And it's used as a manipulation tactic to try to make people who are having like a valid criticism feel like they shouldn't have it. And that's also problematic in itself. So while there's always times where I could get my point across better, because I'm not perfect at everything, I do think that as a general rule I do put myself out there and get myself across well, and whether or not it's ready to be received by people is up to them. And if they don't want to receive it, how they respond to it is up to them. And I'm kind of at the point in my life where I'm no longer willing to really take on other people's issues, and like be responsible for their behavior, because they are responsible for their own behavior. And I think that blaming someone else for how their post made you feel and then subsequently react is just yet another lens where people are not holding themselves accountable for their own behavior. And took a little while, but there is someone in the comments now that's mocking me. Hello, I remember, like, here's the other thing too. When people repeatedly comment like snarky things on my account, despite having ADHD, like I do usually remember you guys, and there's been several over the years who have dedicated like a lot of time to being pretty cruel and dismissive about my posts, and then later have said that they've changed their minds. And like that's again another reason why I keep going, because I think that if someone can do that where they have held a view for a lengthy period of time and have openly been dismissive and cruel to me, and then openly apologize and admit that they've changed, that is like such a huge shift, that if people like that are capable of that, I think anyone is. So it's another part of the page that makes it like a lot more reinforcing to continue maintaining it. But yeah, anyways, good discussion. Basically, the TLDR version is just to say like accountability is important, self-reflection is important. If you double down and refuse to consider the perspectives of anyone, especially when you have a lot of people saying the same thing, you might be in the camp where you're repeating mistakes, and then people can judge you based off of that, and that's acceptable. And yeah, I would honestly like consider the fact that like people who are concerned about horse welfare and who talk about it, there's not really any other motive other than advocating for the horse. And even if you think they're being extreme or wrong, I would encourage people to reflect on the intent behind that. Because the intent behind advocating for horses is typically a noble one, where they want horses to be treated better. Whereas the intent to advocate against welfare discussion and to try to silence people who are participating in it is usually a lot more selfishly motivated. And I think that's therein lies the difference, where even if people think I'm extreme in certain views, which I think in this case is definitely not an extremist view to say that we shouldn't support repeatedly whipping horses. But even if people think that is an extremist view, they're entitled to that. But it's like that my perspective is coming from a place of concern for the horse. Where is yours coming from in trying to attack me and force me into silence? Like, who are you trying to protect in that case? Generally speaking, it's our ego or our idols, etc. In this case, I think it more has to do with people's internal feelings and how they feel about their idol, because her whole post was about ignoring the haters and not letting them get to you. So if they were going to go with that post, they have failed miserably at doing that, by letting it get to them and being all over my page and like boosting the post and boosting my page, and like, especially when people think that I'm doing it to seek attention or whatever. It's like, you're, if that's what you believe, then you're literally giving me what you think that I want. So it's all just very counterintuitive. But yeah, consider what is motivating your behavior, because I can say easily that the reason why I talk about these things with horses is because I feel deeply sorry for horses, and that I can relate to them in a lot of ways with how they've had their voices extinguished and how they've been pressured and coerced into behaving a certain way and effectively having to like wear a mask, because I felt similar to that in my younger years. And I also am remorseful for the way that I've treated horses in the past. And one of the best ways that I can make amends with that, and do better now, is by using what I've learned and sharing it and trying to make a difference in the present. Because I can't go back in a time machine and change the way that I did things or help those horses then. But what I can do is try to make a difference for horses now. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do. And honestly, like, I'm gonna keep sharing a bunch of my old footage of my riding and whatnot, because I found an old USB card recently that had a bunch of videos on it from like 2016, and there's some pretty awful videos of just like how stressed Milo was and whatnot. So I'm gonna do a video on that in the future. What I will admit is that like it is hard to like look back and watch that content because it's very upsetting. So it's something that I do need some time to kind of go through and like build the moral strength to just do it, because it's hard to watch. And like, obviously he's in a way better place now, and like I don't handle him in the same way, and I wouldn't let him get stressed to the degree that I saw in those videos. But it's still very hard to watch, because it's just upsetting to just be so much more aware of it and just like see how how much I was lacking in awareness back then. But I will share those because I think it's an important thing to do. But for anyone who is interested in like seeing where I've come from, if you scroll back far enough on my YouTube, you will find it, and you can even find some pretty fucking embarrassing comments that I've made to defend myself when people called me out, and you can probably notice a lot of parallels between myself and people who are currently in my comments section. And I'm leaving them up because, as embarrassing as they are, and like the fact that I don't like looking back at it because of the discomfort it causes me, I do think that leaving that publicly so people can see it is an important thing to do, because it just gives context for where I came from. And I think that's an important thing, where it's like anyone who's currently doing something that is wrong right now, you don't have to stay that person forever. You can shift, you can make changes, you can do things differently, and you can become a different person. You're not doomed to just follow the same mistakes over and over again and stay that way. You can shift, and people will accept the new version of yourself, and they'll love you for who you are and who you've become. So don't worry about like losing people or not being respected or taken seriously if you admit that you're wrong, because like it's such a good trait. I respect people more when they can admit that they are wrong, or when they talk about mistakes that they've made in the past and they're like open about that. It makes me trust them more because they're self-reflective, and it means that they're, generally speaking, a safer person to be around. So like, don't run from the fear of having to like answer to who you were as your past self, especially when you start to hit the point where you're feeling like you're outgrowing your past self. As hard as it is, the best advice I can give to anyone is just to embrace it and to run with it and to make changes and then see where that path takes you. And like, the initial shift is going to be very scary. It's going to be really uncomfortable, and you're not going to be super keen on it probably, because you're not going to know where the destination is, or you're not even going to know where you're headed initially, and you're going to feel very lost. And it's easy to run away from that and run back to your comfort zone. But if you can just like push through the initial feeling of being lost and not certain about where you're headed, I think what you'll find is that you'll be a lot more at peace if you lean into the new version of yourself that you want to be. Because otherwise, what happens is if you double down and you continue defending old practices, even as you start to outgrow them and you don't agree with them anymore, you have to sit with that internal discomfort and that inner knowing and just like cope with that all the time. And it's a weight that you carry around 24/7, whether you're at the barn or not. And it exhausts you. It will burn you out and it will cause illness. It'll create chronic stress. It makes you anxious. It follows you. Even when you try to run from it, it is always there. So I cannot recommend enough just leaning into it and not try to run from the skeletons in your closet, because as soon as you own them, it takes away anyone's power to come at you for that. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to share that before I go. And like the last thing I'll say is that for me, starting to share that online was really freeing, because one of the reasons why I doubled down initially when I started to have this shift, or when I was getting defensive, was because I was worried about people telling me that I was a fraud if I did change, and telling me that I was wrong, and just essentially shaming me for who I used to be, and having that be a perpetual issue. But if I openly acknowledge it and I bring it up often, it's me taking ownership of that in a way that doesn't allow other people to try to use it against me. And it gives me more control over that narrative of who I am, and more openness. And I'm not running from it anymore, where someone could use it to make me feel bad about myself, because it's not something that I hide or hold with embarrassment. And that's why I'm so open about sharing it, because then it's like people can go through all my old content. They can find some truly awful clips or photos that are not representative of what I agree with now. But if they share them, it's just feeding into what I've made my brand and like who I have become. It's just contributing to that, where I can be like, yep, that's still up there for a reason. I left it up. I don't do that anymore. That's not who I am. Thanks for sharing. It's a reminder of how far I've come. So very scary process, not to downplay it, but I believe in people and I think that anyone can do it. Like even some of the people I've ragged on the most, which I would say the one I've probably ragged on the most out of like any specific trainer is probably Clinton Anderson, because I think that he's one of the most dangerous people in the horse community in terms of what he normalizes. But if he made shifts to be a better person, I would accept him with open arms as well. Like that's the biggest thing, is just like meet someone where they are at, and if they're where they are at is continuing to be a harmful person, then that's what I'm holding them to. And I think that's what anyone should do. So, anyways, thank you everyone for listening. And I'm going to leave this live on my page, and then I also might download it and post it to YouTube if people would prefer to watch it on there. But yeah, thank you for listening, everyone. And I really appreciate all the support. And I'm hoping that we're going to be due for like a pretty big paradigm shift across the horse industry soon, because I do think things are shifting. It's just going to be really difficult, because there's going to be like a clear line of a divide drawn right down the middle as things start to get more pushing towards a big shift. People get more defensive. So, yeah. Anyways, have a good day, everyone, and I'll see y'all later.